AI diffusion controls. To discuss, we have on Lennart Heim, information scientist at RAND, Jimmy Goodrich, advisor to RAND and fellow at CSIS and UCSD, Dylan Patel of SemiAnalysis, and co-hosting Chris Miller of Tufts and Chip War. Welcome to China Talk, everyone, and welcome for the first time, Jimmy. First time, long time.
Oh, it's been a long time coming.
All right, let's just take a step back and remind the audience why we're even doing export controls on all this AI stuff in the first place.
I mean, obviously, we're in like the, massive new era of the AI economy. I mean, if you haven't been living under a rock for the last 5 or 10 years, the most valuable companies in the world, some of the most, amazing new markets being created are being driven by AI. Where does that all sit? It sits in increasingly large, massive data centers with tens, hundreds, possibly one day millions of semiconductor chips, the AI accelerators. The US currently is home to most of these large systems. XAI, OpenAI, Anthropic, AWS, all these companies that are training their models, inferencing them. Most of that today is happening in the United States. So I think what we see here is now the Biden administration looking forward and saying, how do we keep that leadership here? But also at the same time, how do you look around the world and address, the real issue of China possibly diverting some of these chips? Is it in our national security interest to, build massive sovereign AI out in the middle of the Kazakhstani plains? I think that's a super meta question that's kind of being answered in these rules.
So let's stay on that for a second. What was the state of play beforehand, and why was the American national security establishment uncomfortable with, AI data centers being diffused in the pattern they would have been had these rules not come out?
So it's very clear that China was still able to access GPUs, whether that's through renting GPUs from various cloud companies, right? ByteDance is a top customer at Oracle, Google, and a number of other clouds, or through data centers that were being built outside of countries that the U.S. has significant control over, right? This includes, many Middle Eastern countries. This includes many countries like Brazil, but namely, and the poster child is Malaysia, right? So Malaysia is adding around 3 gigawatts of capacity just over the last few years, right? Note that the last few years are, 3 gigawatts of capacity is a humongous amount, right? Meta's capacity in the beginning of 2024 globally for data centers was roughly 3 gigawatts, right? So you're talking about Malaysia as a single country, little old Malaysia, adding an entire meta of footprint in just a few years, right? And sure, some of that is Microsoft. Some of that is other folks like Oracle, which were probably for ByteDance, and a number of other folks. But a lot of it was ByteDance directly and many other Chinese companies. So it is a significant, red spot.
There's a good example where, I read this announcement from this company, YTL Power, which is, building out a bunch of these data centers just across the border in Singapore. And you look into it and, they made this big announcement with Nvidia, but they also made a huge announcement with GDS. But by the way, I've got, as I mentioned, totally still a Chinese company. And, you have to ask yourself, it's literally across the street from the data center hosting this big Nvidia cluster. And then a Chinese company is operating the data center just next door with the same company. A lot of red flags there.
And to put this in broader context here, you covered all the time here, Jordan, regarding export controls, right? Since 2002, we got export controls on PRC, China, Russia, North Korea, arms embargoed countries. Then in 2023, more countries were added, country group D1 and D4, notably UAE, Saudi Arabia, and other countries. And again, since then, we've just seen all of these reports about smuggling, data centers being built elsewhere. And I think what many always forget when we think about AI chips in contrast to missiles or something, you don't need to have a computer in your basement to use it, right? You can dial in remotely. I can be a company building anywhere and then just dial in remotely and can access it. And to some degree, you kind of need to do something about it, right? When it's in built in Malaysia or elsewhere. But then you still have the entities who actually want to prevent them from accessing the underlying computing power still accessing it, right? And this rule, does not cover this.
maybe for Lennart or for Jimmy, I mean, I guess there's two ways to read this. One is this is a major escalation in controls, and it does create a whole lot of additional sets of rules that need to be abided by. I think there's another interpretation which sees this as a sort of natural or inevitable extension of the export controls that have already been in place. That if you've got restrictions on who can buy GPUs that describe certain countries as off limits, certain countries as okay, other countries as requiring a license, is there a sense in which this is sort of like a normal progression of the rules that were already in place?
I would start with let's just see in which way it's an escalation here. It's an escalation in that sense. We previously covered advanced AI chips, certain AI chips, the Nvidia A100s, H100s. And now it also additionally covers AI model weights. Certain one can talk about this later. So expansion this way, we cover more items, but for the model weights, broad exemptions. Another expansion, let's say, well, the whole world now has a classification. This was previously not the case, right? Previously, we had basically a tier 3, no chips were going there. And we had a tier 2, where chips went under conditions or under licensing. You need to ask for a license. I think the most prominent case there is Microsoft trying to expand into the UAE, G42 trying to build data centers there, where before you needed a license for every freaking chip you sent over there, right? If Microsoft builds a data center there, one license. If G42 tries to import the Cerebras super wafer chip, that's another export license. So one way you can now basically read this as actually reducing it might eventually lead to less licenses in total is, if I was Microsoft and I wanted to build in the UAE and Saudi or elsewhere, every single shipment export license. Now I can get the so-called universal verified end user. It's one license, approved, here you go, you can go around the world and deploy, right? So I think if you really read this rule carefully, I think these people who designed it, they're aware of the downsides of BS. We all know they don't have enough money. We all know there's problem with licensing. And the thing you want to do here is you want to take a closer look at the big shipments, at the big data centers, and take a not a close look at the smaller shipments, right, where we have these broad exemptions. So I think it needs to be seen what the net assessment here is on in total shipments, licenses, and more, what we'll be seeing there. And again, I some data on how many chips are actually flowing around the world. Is every country around the world actually buying a bunch of AI chips? I don't know, right? And if other countries are buying them, is it actually them buying them, or is it mostly just Microsoft, Amazon, all of our big hyperscalers just deploying around the world, right? People even call it an empire, right? I think there's this book called Cloud Empire, which posts to this thing of turns out these hyperscalers, these US hyperscalers, they are the ones building around the world, right? And with this new rule, my claim is their life is easier.
I mean, I agree, Chris. I think this is a natural evolution. I think, you went from, the A100 level, they tweaked it in 2023. They added the HBM memory just late last year. And meanwhile, the US government is trying to figure out what do they do with, known diversion, both virtual access to data centers by, companies like ByteDance and others that are, supposedly accessing some of these huge clusters outside of China, but also maybe physical diversion. And we all know that, BIS is quite limited in its enforcement capability. Just trying to run out and check every data center when you don't know what the baseline is of where are all the data centers, where are all the chips going, is just trying to find a needle in the haystack. The government as well, if you saw, hinted that they were kind of thinking about this in the October 2023 update when they said, hey, to industry and comments, do you have other ideas to get at possible diversion? They mentioned things like on-chip controls and on-chip governance. My understanding is that the industry reaction to that was pretty lukewarm, not very interested in the whole idea of on-chip governance. And so if you're not going to do on-chip governance and you need to address the PRC diversion issue, and you want to ensure that, crazy dictators living in a lair out in the Kazakhstani deserts aren't building AGI supercomputers without your knowledge, you're going to have full-time visibility as to where all these are going. And the only way to do that is through a scheme like this. Now, there's tons of questions of is this even doable? Can the, Commerce Department implement something of this magnitude? But, we can get to that later in the show.
All right. I think now is the time to hand the reins over to Lennart to tell us what's actually in this rule. How did the Biden administration try to shape the future of AI diffusion?
Cool. Yeah, how do they do it? I think first thing to understand here, and I think we'll use it throughout the theme of the show, 3 groups of countries. That's important to understand. So previously, 2023, we had 2 groups of countries. We had, let's just call it group 3, PRC, adversaries, arms embargoed countries, no chips. Basically, not a lot of changes to them, right? Continuing, no chips for them. Then there is now a group 2, which is actually most of the world. Previously, this was only certain countries in the Middle East, Central Asia, like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Vietnam, and others. And now we also have a tier 1, or like a group 1, which is the US and 18 friendly nations who they picked. Mostly NATO allies, Five Eyes, Ireland. Again, people can look up the exact names there. So again, we have this one group that's 18 countries and the US. We got this tier 2 that's mostly rest of the world. Then we have this tier 3, which is the adversarial countries, which is like, I don't know, like something like 18 or 20 countries which are in there. And this describes basically the staged approach or the staggered approach here, right? Like continuing no chips for tier 3 for the adversaries. Tier 2 gets chips under conditions. And tier 3 basically unrestricted access. And this is like the theme throughout like this whole scheme. How do you get access to? And like what are the things which are controlled? I mostly talked about AI chips. We had export controls on AI chips before. In addition, we now also have export controls on model weights. How do they define it? It's model weights which use more than 10 to the power 26 floating point operations. So when they're trained, training such a model costs you at least more than 100 million in compute, probably $1 billion just for buying the hardware. And they explicitly exclude publicly available model weights. So if anybody would train such a model, that would be available, no export controls on it. But if I'm like, for example, like OpenAI and DeepMind, who generally like don't release their models, there are export controls on these types of models. Notably, no model exists so far in the public domain which crossed this threshold, right? And I think this is generally like a theme throughout export controls in general. It's like, well, this is about some future risk. Yeah? I mean, you might even want to call it AGI, which at some point comes out there, and you're trying to basically regulate future models, where and how they're being deployed here. And again, they're like broad exemptions which apply. But I think this gives a broad overview of what this framework is about.
Well, can we dig into tier 2 then? Because I think tier 3 of you can't sell to China, pretty clear. Tier 1, you can sell to the US or Japan or UK, pretty clear. Walk us through the rules around tier 2.
So to make it more complicated, so it always matters where we export to, but of course it also matters who exports, right? Is it like an American company or is it a non-American company? So assuming, let's talk about American tier 1 companies, so American and the 18 allied nations, they want to build in tier 2. So I'm Microsoft, want to build in the UAE. We're aware they've got these plans. Previously licensed for each individual shipment, for each export they had. Now they have basically 3 options. The first option is if you below 1,700 H100 equivalents. So they measure it in computing power or total processing performance in the rule. But it's like roughly according to like 1,700 H100s, Nvidia H100s, which is like one of the leading chips right now. I have just an exception. I can just basically export them. There's a presumption of approval and they can go to the UAE and I can build something there. Of course, I should give BS a notification because they want to like still like keep an eye on them, how many these are. The second option is I can get a normal license. And for the normal license, I can export up to a country cap. This country cap applies to everyone who wants to export it. So if AWS was first, they already used some part of this country cap. This country cap sits at 50,000 H100s roughly. So that's a lot of chips, right? To just give people like the number of like clusters with more than 20,000 chips, like they're limited. Again, they're building more and more and more, but this was like the leading clusters just a couple of years ago, right? And like Elon Musk coming out with this 100,000 H100 cluster just happened recently. So that's a lot of chips, and that's a lot of money which you need to throw at these chips to actually export them. And then again, if you're like really serious, you want to really build the big things, well then you undergo one of these verified end user programs. So in September, I think, BIS actually announced a so-called DCVU, Data Center Verified End User Program. The verified end user programs existed since, I think, like forever or something, like for a long time, with an export controls, and just gives you the ability, well, you know, sometimes there are trusted actors where we usually have export controls, so we have like a streamlined way for you of getting access. So they use the DCVU, for example, if you then want to have like a streamlined way to deploy compute around the world. Then, make it more complicated, we now bifurcate this DCVU. There is one which is called Universal Verified End User, which is for all companies which are headquartered in Tier 1, so for France and the US. And there's a national VU for those companies in Tier 2. The main difference is the Universal one allows you to get one license, one authorization you can deploy everywhere. Talked about the Microsoft example. I get one Universal VU and I can deploy everywhere in Tier 2, I'm good to go. Whereas if I'm, for example, G42 in the UAE, I cannot apply this. I only can get a national verified end user agreement for each country specific. So if I want to deploy it in Kenya, new authorization. If I want to deploy it in UAE, new authorization. And then we have like different caps applying to these types of different things. So like what we generally see here is like the best way to deploy around the world is universal verified end user. And this basically says, hey, you guys in tier 1 companies, US, the leading cloud providers, here's your simplified way to deploy around the world. Everyone else, you have a little bit of a harder time here to actually deploy around the world because you don't get a universal agreement. You only get like a country-to-country, country-specific authorization.
And if I want to get a VEU, what do I have to do? How do I prove to the US government that I'm verified?
Yeah, that's exactly the key part of this diffusion rule to that extent, where you say like, well, you can export, but there are conditions. Maybe we should like first talk about what we're worried about, because that's what we already highlighted. Just like, well, we're worried about chips go in one country, but then turns out they go to a different country. They're being diverted. There's like chip smuggling going on, right? So one condition, for example, is like, well, you better check that the chips are where they are, right? So there's, I think, a biannual chip accounting requirement. So you just give like BIS a heads up. It's like, hey, we counted all the chips. They're still all there are, right? And I think BIS even has the right to potentially do like an on-site inspections to check these chips. There's even like a nice shout out to like a nice technical mechanisms to check where the chips are, where they are. And like if one of people like go into the details here, they say that you could use a technical possibility to verify where the chips are via ping. So one way how it's still basically some to echolocation. Like if I have a computer somewhere and I ping different computers around the world and I know how long it takes for this ping to travel, I can basically geolocate it, right? So again, nice technical mechanism how you potentially prove, hey, the chip is still where it is. And I think this is like BIS telling these hyperscalers and all of the hardware companies like, hey, guys, you built this beautiful AI tech. Can you build some technical mechanisms to also help with our problems? And so we got like making sure chips stay where they are. That's the first thing. What is another worry we're having? So we're building these data centers. For what are we actually building these data centers? Sometimes you want to like serve, local government, local business for their for whatever they're doing here. But I think what the more prominent thing is you want to do is just like you want to help all of our leading AI companies to go around the world. You want to make sure that your ChatGPT is locally deployed to like minimize the latency and a lot of times also fulfill certain data requirements, right? You need to have it on site. I think that's like a common prominent motivation for hyperscalers to expand around the world. So when you do this, you put these model weights out there, you deploy them on this cluster, and they're now sitting in this cluster in Saudi Arabia. And I think one key worry which many people have is like, well, these model weights are like, this is still knowledge of the models, right? This is like the most valuable element of the model. So we got to keep it secure. So to become a verified end user, you have like certain cybersecurity requirements, physical security requirements, and all of them basically add up to keep whatever you're doing there, these model weights, the processing secure that nobody can steal it. Because again, stealing the model weights is like similar to stealing GPUs, right? Because I don't need the GPUs anymore if I already stole the model weights and somebody spent a lot of compute on it. So that's how I would summarize it. Yeah, trying to prevent smuggling. You're trying to make sure to keep all the assets there where they are, and most notably the model weights, and keeping them secure. And there's like a bunch of explicit like security requirements for keeping the model weights secure, which is the first time seeing this.
And Lennart, it's probably worth mentioning that when we're talking about chips, we're only talking about the restricted category 3A090 chips, which were essentially NVIDIA A100 level and above. So if you're looking at, older medium tier Intel Xeons, AMD processors, lower performance GPUs, V100s, etc., those don't count. It's basically A100 level and above.
And let's
Absolutely.
just stay on that for 1 second, because the Nvidia press release, we're going to talk a little bit about press releases today, said that like gaming chips were going to be controlled by that.
Well, I don't want to like name the explicit Expo Control numbers here, but there's a category called A and B. And that's important to understand. Tier 2 only has controls on A. That's only data center chips. No GPUs being controlled to any Tier 2. Any gamer sitting in Saudi Arabia, UAE, India, you're fine. It's all good.
It does not apply to autonomous driving chips too, so your Jetsons are excluded from that as well.
Indeed. And it's true. If you're in the PRC, there is a notification requirement. If your gaming chip is above a certain threshold of processing performance, Nvidia at least needs to notify BIS that doing these kinds of exports, so they have like some visibility into these kinds of things. So again, my understanding is like there is no changing on these gaming GPUs anymore. And when we talk about data centers being built, all we talk about here is AI. Whenever I say share of computing power, it's AI computing power. Whenever we talk about data centers, we talk about data centers with GPUs. with chips which cost like $30,000 each. This is not about your data center, which is being used for you watching Netflix, using anything in a Microsoft suite or cloud, whatever. This is about gaming GPU, well, sorry, not gaming GPUs, data center GPUs being used for AI workloads, right? All of these other things can continue as usual.
Yeah, I think a good way to think about it is like you've got your standard, data center. It's going to be for web storage, but we're now talking about accelerated AI compute, which is a entirely different category of data center. You have a whole lot more liquid cooling. You've got more cooling fans and towers. You literally engineer the data center sometimes differently to accommodate for these kind of AI accelerated computing clusters. You can see it visibly when you're driving around places like Loudoun County and you see, oh, well, this data center doesn't have the 50 cooling fans surrounding it or the massive compressed liquid cooling tanks. Like there's a categorical difference between AI data centers and your traditional web storage or, cold storage data center.
So how does this play out over time? So right now we've got the level of chips that are restricted. Over time, chips get better at a pretty rapid rate. Is this something you'd expect to get sort of updated on a regular basis so that as chips become aged out over time that they get opened up? Or is actually this going to largely remain frozen so you have real restrictions imposed on what types of data centers can be built in third countries?
I mean, let's take the policy question aside, if you should move it up or not, that's for later. But if we just look at the reality here, computing chips are improving, they're improving exponentially. That's the case, and more chips will run into these kinds of things. And more importantly, we now nicely claim, well, it's only AI data center chips, but more and more chips are becoming AI chips. More and more of your workloads are becoming AI applications, right? I mean, everybody's kind of seen it, whatever software you open nowadays, it has a new, nice AI feature. And I think this highlights a key challenge here. More chips are becoming AI chips, therefore they have increased performance. They might eventually hit these kinds of things. So for example, at some point, an Apple Ultra chip or something might eventually hit these kinds of thresholds. Now you got to pose this question to the US government and others, should we now control these chips and how useful are these chips for actually being used for the things we're worried about here? It gets a bit more complicated here, right? Can you just hook up a bunch of Mac minis and build a supercluster out of it? Well, it's clearly not as good as doing the other thing, but practically speaking, computing power is computing power here, right? And it's just any key challenge here. When you have something exponentially improving, you draw a line in the sand and eventually will just get crossed, and there needs to be continuous improvements in looking at it. And also just assessing the threat models, right? Maybe it turns out it's all fine for the next 3 years with AI. Well, then clearly this line should go up. But if stuff's getting crazy next year, there might be reasons to eventually control these kinds of things and just see how you can manage it, right? Again, compute is a blunt tool, export controls are a blunt tool, you will be hitting more things, and the more things become AI, the more things you will be hitting. And I think that's a fundamental challenge of this framework.
Dylan, about the financial implications for the companies, because I think one of the debates that has been had is this impactful to the companies, or will they sell the same number of GPUs, just put them in different countries? And I thought Dylan might have a view on that.
So this regulation definitely impacts the financials of many companies in the space, right? First and foremost, Nvidia, right? You can argue, hey, the GPUs are just going to get rerouted, but not always, right? There's a significant number of GPUs that would not have data center capacity in the West, right? There is a data center shortage. This is why people are converting anything they can into a data center. This is gone, right? And therefore there is absolutely, to some extent, you can't reshore everything, right? And to some extent, China was increasing demand for GPUs and making the elasticity of the demand required sort of supply that could be created and sold to them. There is an impact, right? Nvidia does get impacted. It isn't just wholesale rerouted because of data center capacity, because potentially even demand issues, right? Furthermore, right, there's the flip side, right? Companies that can get a universally verified list are going to be massively beneficial.
If there's real demand out there for a lot of these huge AI data centers, which there is, companies are going to find a way to be able to get these licenses. And in particular, for the universal VEUs, the large hyperscalers, they have the resources. They've got huge teams, lawyers. I assume that, and they're all, FedRAMP certified, for example, like the rules required. It's going to be, as you point out, a lot easier for them to get it. The big question mark is going to be these NVUs, these, sovereign AI cloud startups or small GPU accelerated cloud projects in different parts of the world are they going to have the wherewithal, to be able to do this? I think some of them that are incredibly well resourced, like G42, absolutely going to make a shot. But will the Nepalese cloud supplier that's in Nepal that's thinking about this actually be able to make it through? And what if they don't? Should they have been building an AI data center in the first place? I think those are actually some honest questions that should be asked. And maybe this will force a little bit of a rethink amongst some of the sovereign players that were thinking about, spending $5-10 billion of their, government coin on these data centers instead of healthcare or education or transportation for their citizens. To maybe rethink some of those. I think it's a whole nother topic, which is what is the actual viability of some of these, sovereign AI projects in different parts of the world. Some of them are totally legitimate and are real demand. Others, I think we all know are somewhat questionable. One of the key things is you got to look to what the companies are saying to their shareholders. In particular, one thing to watch really carefully is to see if any of the companies that, are going to be affected are going to put out statements to their shareholders that notify them of, possible negative impact to their company. I don't think we've seen anything yet. That's not saying they won't. Obviously, it's a huge regulation. It's going to take them some time to work through it and understand exactly how revise their financial projections. But that's going to be key to watch is, what do the companies tell their shareholders in terms of the impact? Because we've seen before where companies have said this is going to be, catastrophic to their business. We're going to have a, massive negative effect. And then they clarify to shareholders that it won't have any effect to their company at all.
Yeah, I think for anyone who's worked in the Expo Control business, one is used to this. I think what's different this time is that it's public, which is being done via press statements and quite interesting to read press statements. I think the Oracle one, is definitely one to read for people, just to get an idea of what the mood is out there. And again, just as was Jimmy's just saying, it's the question is are they now actually complaining because there are these big financial impacts, right? Or is it mostly because, the administration is changing. Now you can scream full throttle without a bunch of constraints, right? So to some degree it makes sense that have a shot to actually might kill it in the next administration. So I'm having a hard time balancing these kinds of things. I'm just what maybe there's a real impact. Can we talk about this? Or it's just you having a big shot at this? Because again, having such a public backlash against we have not seen this on Expo Controls before.
Well, it impacts every company differently depending on where you're sitting in the market. So if you're obviously, a company that's designing and selling controlled GPUs, you are the most impacted. If you are a company that's going to be integrating them into your hardware, selling them as part of a solution like Oracle or others, you're going to be kind of basically as impacted as the chip makers. Where it actually might come out to be more favorable is going to be for the tier 1 hyperscalers, because we've discussed before, kind of you get one license, you can operate around the world. And then, of course, the sovereign NVU operators in these tier 2 countries, I'm sure there's going to be a large group of them that are just not going to be able to make it through the NVU authorization. But there's going to be a larger number that will. I think it's going to be interesting to see where the dust settles.
Yeah, it's interesting, the political economy of, Google, Amazon, and Microsoft not coming out in favor of this, even though it is a sort of new regulatory burden, which has the potential to wipe out a ton of their potential of their competitors, so that, Brunei, if they want cloud, is going to have to go to AWS, not build sovereign AI brought to you by, Nvidia DGX Cloud or what have you.
It's important to note, when in the history of sort of business and industry and regulation, has there been an industry that has ever welcomed, a new regulatory framework that essentially, is regulating most of their business? There's not many companies that have welcomed that. So it's just natural for them to say, hey, we'd much rather be selling these things to whom we pick and choose at our own pace and scale. And here what the Biden administration, the government is basically saying is, no, we need to have some oversight to check and see who those customers are. We need to ensure that they're living up to the security standards, that China doesn't have access to them. It's interesting if you go back to the debate of should there be seatbelts in cars? Well, guess what? The car companies thought that was a bad idea at the beginning too. Or should there be a Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which is an interesting parallel where, industry cried wolf and said, no, we can't have our hands tied behind our back because we need to be able to do business in Zimbabwe extracting oil. And, you got to give grease payments in order to, extract that oil. And so the law passed, and guess what? People just complied and moved on. So, I think it's just natural for business to not like new regulatory sort of umbrellas over their business model. I don't think it should be a surprise at all. What's the impact going to be? Again, we have to look at the actual financial statements and see how this is going to pan out over time.
So one other question on that front, which is Dylan mentioned all the build out that's happening in Malaysia is one good example. And there's been discussions, some of that's for Malaysian domestic demand. Some of it might be diversion towards China, maybe a lot of it diversion. How do you think, Jimmy, about the share of GPUs currently going to tier 2 countries that is for tier 2 country demand versus likely be diversionary? I mean, is it 20% diversion? Is it 80% diversion? Hard to know exactly, I'm sure.
Well, no one really knows because those numbers are going to be, one that only the suppliers, both of the chips and then sort of the server level systems integrators have any sort of visibility into. What was interesting, we saw, I think it was in 2023 and 2024, some spikes in sales to Southeast Asia. As Dylan pointed out, there's real data center growth happening there. Indonesia is also building data centers. A lot of it are Chinese companies building data centers locally. But the economy slowing in China, some of the listed Chinese data center companies like GDS, 21 Vianet, they're actually growing faster outside of China than inside of China. I think there's been, though, a number of reports from The Information, the Wall Street Journal, that ByteDance has been one of the big companies. Remember, they're technically headquartered in Singapore. That's been looking at accessing some of these data centers that are being built in Malaysia. As I mentioned before, in some cases, you've got a big AI accelerated data center that's right next door to a GDS data center owned by the same company. For example, Huawei, others have had big manufacturing operations in Malaysia, and there's been some, reports of diversion going on there. So I think what's the real end use? We don't really know. Actually, one of the really interesting things is that in some cases, it's been reported that Nvidia actually physically went out and looked at the data centers and made sure that their chips were being installed. They only looked once, though, and as soon as the inspection was over, then they were all just shipped out. And actually, the whole data center was built just as a sort of scam for the data center inspection. They just packed it all up and moved it all out. It's kind of like one of those, Looney Tunes animations where they just kind of pack it all up and just sort of secretly swipe it out the back door. So I think what these rules now are saying is okay, there just needs to be more oversight. What was in place before, which was mostly industry self-initiating, which were good efforts, is just not enough.
Yeah, and building on top of this, I mean, none of this is news to anybody who followed the semiconductor industry and these Expo Controls. There's just the widest schemes to do what you want to do. The nice thing about computing power here is actually you kind of want to move the unit of governance here from AI chips is so hard to govern. They can be smuggled, they can go elsewhere, and even if you know where they are, you don't know who's using them. You kind of want to change the unit to computing power. Who's using the computing power here, right? And you kind of move in this domain by saying even if we sell it to this trusted entity, we need to have this continuous ongoing relationship with you being a verified end user, and then you check on your customers that this computing power is not diverted, right? Again, we could have all of the chips in the world, not on the PRC, they could still use it all, right? You would just see it all around being built. So you kind of want to make sure whoever's operating this, you check what they're doing with it. And it's nothing new. This is exactly what cloud businesses are doing, right? And it gives just this, just practically speaking, the better governance node, right?
Well, and there's also another really important element to this, which is that ensuring the U.S. doesn't just look the other way as all of its data center capacity would be built overseas, particularly by, deep-pocketed sovereign nations. We've seen this movie before with semiconductors where through the early 2000s, and Chris, you wrote about this so well in your book, Chip Wars, whether it was Taiwan, South Korea, China, Singapore, doling out billions of dollars of cash, you know what, we really think that's important. We'll take your semiconductor factory over here. We'll take it over here. We'll give you all the cash and tax incentives to build them in these different countries. And so then now, the U.S., it's well known, its share of semiconductor manufacturing dropped below 20% from much higher, near 40% in 1990. And now it's having to spend billions and billions of dollars to recover that. And I think what we're seeing is this is a preemptive shot in the arm to try and keep some of that advanced, data center capacity here in the United States. Because, if you look at some of the countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, they're deep pocketed. They're sitting on well over $1 trillion in cash and eyeballing all these companies and data centers like, we'll take this, we'll take that. And, I think the fear is, we wake up 10 years and we're like, oh, wait a minute. How did all of our AI somehow end up in a desert? And wait a minute, these guys they're not exactly best friends with us. They're also friends with Russia and China. Wait a minute. We should have had some policy like 10 years ago to stop that from happening. And I think that's also here a big component. Like, I don't know, Lennart, you should probably also talk about the whole ratio thing, which is really important for the tier one. Because this gets at that issue.
Yeah, let's just staying on that for 1 second, Jimmy. It is, I think, illustrative that the Biden administration paired this with an executive order that's trying to sort of like create easier ways to get carve-outs when it comes to building new power plants. And Trump also, like, someone's gotten to him on this as well. His initials might be E&M, but you never know. Talking about the importance of power generation, which is the big bottleneck domestically in building out more data centers, more data center capacity. So, anyways, yeah, it's a two-step game. Like, you both if you don't want the stuff to be built abroad, you also need to like make sure that it's possible to be built in all those tier one countries. And there's going to have to be a domestic regulatory agenda paired with all this stuff to enable it. Though then again, I mean, like, during World War III, it's just a weird like asset. And they're just these buildings. Like, I don't know how you protect them, but whatever, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Lennart, there's this gave me kind of like Washington Convention, like 1923, like the US gets 5 ships, the UK gets 5 ships, Japan gets 3 ships, like, Germany gets 1.5 ships, whatever, energy. But now we're doing this for AI compute. What's the whole ratio deal within this regulation?
Yeah, I think the word ratios could be better picked. I'm not even sure if they use it. You can just call it share. I think Jimmy was alluding to it. It was like, well, now we have a share of 20% of semiconductors being produced in the US. Well, that's not great. Should be different, right? And what this framework does, if you're such a universal verified end user, you can deploy around the world, so you're Microsoft of the world, there are a couple of requirements. The first requirement is you better make sure that 75% of all of your AI computing power is built in tier 1. If you're a US company, 50%, again, of the whole share, you build in US. So basically saying, Microsoft, half of your computing power, keep it in US. And therefore, as we were just talking about, as it also just came out recently, the AI executive order on like making permitting for the infrastructure, building data centers, getting more energy out there is like critical here, right? If you tell companies, well, you better build here, we also got to simplify it for them. And it's not a secret that we've been having some issues getting like the transmission lines and everything else right in the US to actually have the data center build out we might need in the future. So you got to keep 50% in US, you got to keep 75% in tier 1, so there's 25% remaining for the rest of the world. Again, that's per company. So this is not like the total share of all the chips around the world. And their constraint is so you can have 25% in tier 2, because obviously you cannot do anything to tier 3. And within this tier 2, you're only allowed to put 7% in a single country. So if I'm Microsoft, I want to build a big cluster in Saudi Arabia, the cluster can only be 7% of my whole computing power. That's like the limit I can be doing. And yeah, it's kind of like putting numbers on this and says, America first. America and our partners first. You better build here. You got to keep the data centers here for the reason we just discussed. That's the best way to keep them secure. It's this new strategical asset. I can't tell you yet which role AI will play in World War III and how long these data centers are going to be standing there. But at least the current stage is like, it's the least important to keep them here so we can keep them secure. We can keep them all the way secure.
I just think it's, definitely forward leaning in that part, because very rarely has the United States thought about we're at the cusp of an industrial revolution. How do we stay ahead with our allies and lead in it? Because there's just been so many other industries, particularly on sort of the physical asset side of things, that we've just seen dispersed around the world. And then you just have to look to like the procession of the sort of like kiss the ring voyages that were going on in the last 2 years. Were like, as soon as Saudi Arabia or UAE hold a tech conference, it's like every tech leader in the world is over there saying, oh my God, sovereign AI is so amazing. This is awesome. it's not because they've got this like huge population of internet users that want to like access ChatGPT. And it's not because, they could, location wise, it's like close to some special market. It's just because we're sitting on a ton of cash. If you're a big tech company and you're offered a ton of cash, you're going to build it there no matter what. And so I think now what the US government is saying is, all right, we know a ton of cash is really good for your company, but we also have to think about, what does this mean for national security? Let's not forget that the fastest supercomputer in the United States that models nuclear weapons that was just installed at Lawrence Livermore National Lab is 44,000 GPUs. This rule allows a country to build a supercomputer of that size. So we're still talking about every country in that tier 2, tactically able to build really powerful supercomputers. Some of the most powerful in the United States aren't even up to that size and scale.
Yeah, the numbers are really, really critical here, and also just a status quo. So if anybody wants to read the rule, they have like total processing performance there. These are big numbers. Nobody will be able to grasp them, right? I think like what we most talk about is like this H100 equivalent here. And when we set these ratios, we say like keep 75% in tier 1. Well, you can for sure expect that US government crunch these numbers before know that right now more than 75% is in tier 1 and more than 50% is in the US, like probably majority, like way more than 50% is in the US, right? So if you just look at the status quo, if you look at the current reality of like AI compute around the world, it's pretty grim in that sense. It's like fairly concentrated. It's concentrated with all of the big hyperscalers. It's concentrated in the US, then second in like these other tier 1 nations, and then at some point come these tier 2 nations. That's just the current status quo. And you just really want to keep it this way because, as Jimmy was saying, there's some people out there with like really deep pockets. And we're just saying like, yep, these pockets are deep, but like we don't go all the way, right? We just got to keep it in a certain.
I think this whole like keep the data centers here kind of speaks out a big central contradiction of like the Biden's approach to this at the beginning, because, the Biden line towards China was always like a small yard, high fence. Like, we're not trying to contain your economic rise, but this is a national security question. And, we're just not comfortable with you having this technology to like model missiles or whatever. But, these regulations only matter if AI becomes more important, and not just in a specifically national security context, also in an economic growth context. So like you're only using these in order to constrain the type of technology which is not just impacting military outcomes, but also has a potential to as Jimmy was saying, have an industrial revolution level size impact on your nation's economic prospects. So I am just, interested in two parts of this. Like, one, to what extent having all the data centers in the US and its friends is going to sort of privilege those countries in gaining more from what AI is going to bring from an economic benefit perspective. And then like, whether, if you can, whether, if you're in a country where there's some lag to get to it or what have you, like that's like or you're not, or you're sort of, you're stuck going through AWS or Microsoft, if there's like some like vertical integration that you're sort of losing out as a nation and gaining the economic benefits from artificial intelligence. And second, like, whether the Trump administration is going to stick to this line, because like, it doesn't make sense really, because you obviously are constraining other countries' sort of like future economic potential by limiting their access to AI. And that's, that's a trade-off that like you have to make. But once you have the, once you have Trump talking about we're in an AI race and like I intend to win it, then that comes with second order effects, which don't necessarily lead to, oh yeah, small yard, high fence. Like we're going to sit down with Wang Yi for 12 hours and tell him, no, you really shouldn't be upset about these export controls. Like they're just for this like small little thing that like really isn't all that important except for your missile systems.
Okay, but Jordan, I take that one, but then, isn't the fact that API access is still broadly open the counter argument?
Exactly
what I would have brought up.
So like, I don't even know if it matters. Like, it's just like an off switch in the future, I guess, unless there's some like big lag thing where using compute in a tier 1 country, if you're far away from it, is gonna, make you grow less fast or something.
Yeah, I think latency might be an issue here. I don't think that's the case for current frontier AI models because the computational workload is so high. But to some degree, of course, you constrain people from like the underlying product, like the GPUs, where you say you have more flexibility and you can do more things, versus you only get computing power as infrastructure as a service. But if you talk to any engineer who actually does like leading AI development, you don't have them in your room anyways, in your basement, right? This is just like you actually dialing in remotely via cloud computing. So most people access it. And I think everybody knows from their own personal life, more and more stuff move to the cloud. How good and bad this is and what the downsides are, there are many, right? And I think the general notion you just discussed is like, well, AI is a dual use technology. We talked about AI chips, like more and more chips becoming AI chips. This is like a fundamental issue here. Expo controls are blunt, and doing something on AI is blunt. It's like really, really hard to carve out this one specific thing you're worried about. Let's just imagine the thing you're worried about is, let's just call it AGI. Well, it turns out, by definition, it's pretty general. You can do all kinds of stuff with it, right? You can try to take over the world with it, but you can also just like grow your economy. And that's the fundamental issue here, right? And I think that needs to be understood. But like, you can access the computing power. Again, no constraint on this unless you really want to train a really, really big model, which is new with these controls, and do whatever you want. But it gives you, similar to like maybe the banking system, it gives you this on-demand access for eventually cutting off access, right? This is weaponized interdependence for sure. This is nothing new, but this is a tool which has been used.
So in this data center revolution, this huge build out, you're going to see a massive upstream in infrastructure, energy, water, all the different, this concrete, steel, it's going to be poured and smelted to build all these data centers. And that's going to drive a ton of growth here in the United States. Already, you can see major industries being born and formed around this. And so, I think that's going to be a huge net positive for the United States and its allies. However, on the flip side, like there's been a ton of published research that shows you benefit mostly from diffusing AI in your economy as a supergood. And it's ensuring that, if you're Thailand, you're going to get a lot more bang out of your buck if you've got, say, 5 billion to incentivize your economy to use AI as opposed to trying to develop your own sovereign AI. And so if you can quickly roll in AWS or OpenAI or Meta and others and integrate AI into your banking system, your utilities, your public transportation, healthcare, those are going to be the economies that win. And you don't have to have locally hosted AI to do that. Where it gets a little tricky is going to be, sensitive personal data that countries don't want to leave their borders. And there's going to be a solution, whether it's an NVEU or a UVU, where they'll be able to, make that happen. Like, it's important to realize, like, these rules don't stop you from building everything in tier 2. They're definitely able to do it. Just have to jump through a few more hoops. But we should get to China.
Okay. Jimmy, China.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, like, the mega question to all of this is, can China fill the void? I haven't met anyone who wants to see China fill the void anywhere. And, China having the digital Silk Road, whether it's in Africa, in the Middle East, is a major challenge for the United States. I mean, just travel the world to see Huawei or ZTE phones in the pockets of, citizens in the developing world, or Huawei Cloud offering email and web services, or Chinese companies offering smart city and surveillance. However, that is entirely different from AI accelerated solutions. And what we see today is that, due to the fact that this technology is really hard, being able to produce sub 7 nanometer semiconductors for advanced AI accelerators, being able to 3D stack layers and layers of the most advanced DRAM for HBM memory, and then on top of that, all the export controls have meant that China is today struggling to be able to meet its own demand with indigenous AI GPU production. The reports are that basically China is operating 1, maybe 2 factories to produce advanced logic chips. And they're roughly around 7 nanometer, which is 2, maybe 3 generations behind where TSMC, Samsung, and, one day Intel will be. On the HBM memory, China is just starting up a bunch of efforts, and they're several years behind. And so, the big question is, can China somehow, swoop into the UAE, swoop into Brazil and India and be like, okay, we've got a ready to go, ecosystem, full stack? The answer is today, no. Even in trying to, give deliveries to Baidu and Tencent within China China is still struggling to meet a lot of those fulfillments and orders. And there's been plenty of reports around how the lower yield and the production issues at SMIC and other areas have been really creating challenges for China. Now, that's not to say they're going to get better. Obviously, they will. And sort of anybody who's written off China from an innovative perspective usually gets it wrong. However, in this case, it's not just about, it's about scale. And scale and innovation are really important. You can have, and China will produce at some point 5, maybe even 4 nanometer chips, but you need to be able to produce millions of them. You need to be able to have millions of units of HBM. You need to have millions of packaging substrates to be able to integrate into that. And then you have to have really good software on top of it so that you can easily plug and play with your customers worldwide. And that's one thing that people don't realize is like, even if China could export large quantities or even medium tier quantities of their AI chips, is a sovereign AI company in Thailand really going to have the skill set to completely re-engineer their software stack to run on, say, like the Huawei Mindsboard? Probably not. That's a skill that probably only exists in, say, the United States and China. So I think what's really going to happen actually is that a lot of these developing economies that don't want to go through the hoops to get licenses, they'll just buy H20s, which are a good chip, by the way, and it can be used for inference. And frankly, a lot of the play for these sovereign AI projects is in inference, not necessarily training, because then they can, as a business model, rent that out to other companies, other players. So I don't know. I'm a little skeptical of some of the claims that China is going to swoop in and sort of eat away market share from these U.S. players. The facts today are just that China can't meet its own demand. That could change. We have to watch it really closely, and that's also why all roads lead back to export controls on semiconductor manufacturing equipment, on leading edge semiconductor manufacturing fabrication. If those don't work, then none of this policy works. It's like a house of cards.
Lennart, so Jimmy mentioned inference. The last show we did about a month ago was talking about the increasing importance of inference as opposed to training when it came to producing the best and getting the most out of, producing the smartest and getting the most out of models. How does that technological development interact with this rule, which was years in the making, probably before scaling on inference time computing became a thing that everyone was aware of?
Yeah, I mean, this rule leverages existing Expo Control, so it uses just to use same Expo Control number, so the H20 is not being controlled. So like everyone around the world can buy an H20 as much as they want to. So good for Nvidia, good revenue to be made, like lots of revenue to be made with these kinds of chips right now in China. But I think, as we talked about the last time, this line between like what is training, what is deploying, like it becomes more blurry over time. And then we've just seen like, well, if you deploy for longer, you let the model think for longer, leads to better capabilities. And I think all of this is basically to say like, well, if you want to have like a working framework here and you want to intervene across the whole capability landscape here, something needs to be done on the H20. For the careful readers of this rule, actually, there's a reporting requirement if your chip has a higher memory bandwidth than a certain amount which H20 meets. So my understanding right now is I need to go back, at least if you export it, you at least to give BIS a heads up on this so they have like some idea of like how many H20s are being out there. Which I think is probably a sensible move, right? If not a lot of people are buying it, maybe it might be fine. But if many people are buying it, you might want to intervene on it and like think about it more. But I think, these Expo Control eventually need to like, in my opinion, like expand it to also cover the H20 here, so we have like something more exhaustive and like cover the new developments in it.
Yeah. But this point like is super important because if you read carefully the criticism from the private sector, it's going to tie the hands of American companies, and China is going to come through. And the reality is, today, no one has been able to point to or find a single data center outside of China that's, at scale, meaning say 10, 20,000 H100 equivalent, fully loaded with semiconductors that are built indigenously inside the PRC. Those don't exist today. And so, and again, there's a huge barrier that a local sovereign player would have to overcome to be able to port their whole system to not work on, say, CUDA software and want to work on Huawei Mindsboard. That, I think, is actually like a super unspoken and underlooked, major advantage that, U.S. companies have is that, guess what? Everyone's already been coding and developing AI frameworks on the existing firmware that these companies, AMD included, have developed. And so like that in itself is also a huge disincentive to go out and use all these Chinese systems. Now, I think like China could play it smart and be like, all right, we're gonna actually, tell our Chinese companies to use like a larger quantity of H20s, and then we're gonna start exporting a smaller quantity to some like keystone projects to try and claim that the US AI diffusion rule isn't working. But again, it'll be like really important to look at the overall numbers here to see what the actual scale is. If there's a day when China can produce millions of comparable GPUs loaded with comparable HBM, then we would definitely have to take a hard relook at this rule and what the levels are being set at. But today the evidence shows that China's not there yet. They may get there, and you have to relook at it if that's true, but not yet.
Yeah. I think if you ask me, like, what's the most likely way this could fail, we're just like, well, it's fine now, so we'll be fine in the future. And I think that's like far from granted, right? It needs to be monitored. We need to like figure out what the evidence is and just look at the data. Like as Jimmy was just saying, when we tried to find data centers, we didn't find any. I tried to find AI models trained with Huawei or like with Chinese AI hardware. I had like 2 systems which I found, which was trained with ASIN 910s. Out of like, I think they have like 700 systems in the database, and like 260 where we have the hardware. So it's a small minority of systems. People are not really using it. But if this changes, right? And like, again, this is also a job for the intelligence community and everybody else. This needs to be monitored, needs to be adapted. This is the most likely way this can go wrong if you're like too stringent that ever just like fill the void.
One last point I want to make is just on the, what you don't get from having your own data center question. Kevin Xu wrote a fantastic article about DeepSeek's 3 advantages. And one of the things that he pointed to about part of their special sauce is the fact that because they came from a quant hedge fund, like they've been running their own servers for 15 years. And, one of his theories of how they were able to be so efficient with their training is the fact that, they have expertise all the way up and down the stack when it comes to training models. And so I think there is a universe in which sort of having to outsource a lot of what you end up doing to Google or AWS or what have you. I can imagine being futures in which we miss out on technological innovations because you don't have companies who can sprout up in other countries around the world, being able to sort of explore different ways of training and deploying models. But these are the sorts of trade-offs when you're making when it comes to when you're weighing all the different risks here.
Yeah, I think we'd be wrong to tell ourselves we can just have the best of both worlds all at the same time, and this comes at no cost, right? This is clearly not the case when you intervene this. But again, that's the rule. That's where people fall on like how it falls regarding national security risk and how much should be done here, and that's what we got.
Awesome. All right. Thanks so much for being part of the trial.
Thanks so much for having me.